The starship shuddered violently as explosions rippled through the corridors. Red lights flashed in frantic pulses, casting long, trembling shadows on the walls. Smoke choked the air, and the distant screams of the Empress's warriors echoed through the ship's metallic veins. The enemy had struck with precision, targeting the command decks first, knowing that breaking the chain of leadership could collapse the fleet entirely. Amidst the chaos, a human officer named Elias stood perfectly still. His dark uniform, adorned with Earth's insignia, was singed and dirtied from the initial blast, but his calm gaze remained fixed on the advancing enemy. Around him, alien warriors, tall, armored beings with gleaming exoskeletons, fought and retreated, their weapons casting streaks of green and purple across the smoke-filled corridors. The Empress had already left for the evacuation pods, her voice a serene echo in Elias' communicator. "Get to safety," she had said, but Elias shook his head. Safety was not an option when she was still at risk. He moved quickly, his steps precise and economical, taking advantage of the narrow corridors to set up barricades. Human ingenuity, Elias knew, was a weapon that did not rely on brute strength alone. Using a combination of hacked security doors and discarded alien energy cells, he created traps along the path that the attackers would be forced to take. He didn't have the physical superiority of the alien warriors, but he had something far more unpredictable: adaptability. The first wave of enemy soldiers rounded the corner, hulking and relentless, their weapons firing bright bursts that scorched the walls. Elias ducked behind a reinforced panel, fingers moving over a control interface he barely understood but had learned in minutes. The corridor's floor vibrated as a panel he had rigged suddenly shot upward, knocking the first two attackers off balance. The rest hesitated, surprised by the ingenuity of a single human in the face of overwhelming numbers. "Impressive," one alien warrior hissed in their guttural language, pausing to reassess the human. Elias smiled grimly. "You underestimate humans too often," he muttered under his breath. Time was critical. Every second the Empress was delayed in her escape was a second closer to capture, or death. Elias' mind raced, calculating the flow of the enemy, their patterns and weaknesses in their formations. He repositioned energy conduits to create temporary force fields, diverting the enemy into narrow passages where their numbers counted for less. The alien warriors were fast, precise, and brutal, but Elias anticipated them. He rolled aside as a massive figure lunged forward, its clawed hand striking the wall where he had been moments before. Sparks flew, and the corridor shook again, but the human remained untouched. He triggered another trap, a grav field disruption that sent three attackers tumbling into each other, disarming them in the process. In the communication feed, the Empress's voice rang with a mixture of relief and concern. "Elias, the pods are almost ready. You don't have to do this." "I know," he replied, voice steady, "but someone has to stay. You can't leave the fleet undefended." The enemy commander, sensing something unusual, slowed their advance, eyes scanning the corridor. Elias knew that a direct confrontation would come soon, and he welcomed it. The human mind, adaptable and unpredictable, was often the deadliest weapon against alien logic and strength. He ducked into a side chamber, sealing the door behind him. Using a console he barely understood, he rerouted power from the ship's auxiliary systems into the security network, reinforcing barriers and locking doors intermittently. Every move forced the enemy to reconsider, buying precious moments for the Empress's escape. As the waves of attackers pressed forward, Elias' ingenuity became the thread holding the corridor together. Energy pulses, force field disruptions, and controlled environmental hazards slowed the aliens, turning what should have been a simple advance into a labyrinth of hazards and confusion. The aliens were strong, fast, and relentless, but their rigidity was their weakness. Humans, Elias reflected, thrived on unpredictability, on thinking beyond the obvious. At one point, he found himself cornered in a junction, the enemies closing in from 3 directions. He paused, analyzing the situation, then triggered the gravity disruptors in a precise sequence that sent the attackers sprawling into each other. He ran down the corridor, sealing it behind him just as reinforcements from the Empress's warriors reached the junction, enabling them to regroup. The corridors of the starship were now littered with disabled enemies, temporary barricades, and the hum of malfunctioning systems. Smoke rose from ruptured conduits, painting the walls in shifting patterns of orange and red. Elias pressed forward, determined to hold one last point before the Empress left the ship entirely. He arrived at the central control hub, a room filled with blinking lights, holographic maps, and a faint hum of the ship's core. This was the final choke point. The enemy had already breached the outer corridors, and if he fell here, the Empress's path would be compromised. He quickly rerouted more power, creating overlapping fields that would slow the enemy and give him tactical advantage. The first commander arrived, a massive alien figure with armor gleaming under the emergency lights. Elias held his ground, his hand hovering over a panel that could collapse part of the corridor above them. The alien lunged, weapons blazing. Elias pressed a series of buttons and the corridor floor shifted, sending the commander stumbling. Quick, precise, and relentless, Elias used his environment as a weapon, forcing the alien to adapt constantly. Through the comms, the Empress's voice was a calm anchor in the chaos. "You're doing more than anyone could have, Elias. Get out when you can." "I'll wait until I'm sure the path is clear," he said. Minutes stretched like hours. Every enemy wave brought new challenges, but Elias met each one with strategy, courage, and calm determination. His human instincts, combined with learned knowledge of alien technology, made him an unpredictable force. The aliens, strong and numerous, were caught off guard by the ingenuity of a single human standing firm. Finally, the last of the Empress's warriors entered the final pod. She appeared, her regal presence a calm contrast to the chaos, and gave Elias a nod of gratitude. "Go," she said firmly. Elias hesitated, scanning the corridors. The enemy was regrouping, preparing for one last push. He gave a small, resolute nod to himself. Humans were not just fighters. They were thinkers, adapters, and protectors. He would hold this position as long as necessary. As the pod lifted from the deck and shot toward the waiting fleet, Elias triggered one final sequence of traps. Corridors shifted, energy conduits discharged, and the enemy was slowed just enough. Smoke and sparks filled the air, and for a moment, time seemed suspended. Elias found a vantage point, watching the pod disappear into the void. He was alone now, surrounded by chaos, but he did not panic. Humans thrived in adversity, and he had proven that even in the face of overwhelming odds, courage and intelligence could hold the line. The enemy regrouped for the final assault, but Elias had already anticipated their moves. He darted from cover to cover, activating environmental defenses and turning the corridor into a maze of hazards. The aliens were relentless, but the humans' adaptability turned their strength into a liability. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had lost meaning. Elias' muscles ached and smoke stung his eyes, but he continued. Every enemy force that advanced was slowed, turned back, or incapacitated. He was a single human against an army, yet he moved with the precision and focus of a machine. Finally, the last enemy forces halted, unable to advance further without risking annihilation in the traps. Elias took a deep breath, surveying the corridor. It was a war zone, littered with debris, sparks, and the faint hum of failing systems, but it had held. He allowed himself a small smile. The Empress had escaped. Her empire had been given a chance to survive, and humans had proven once again that their ingenuity, courage, and determination were forces to be reckoned with. Alarms blared, systems flickered, but Elias stood tall. Alone, exhausted and battered, he remained unbroken. The galaxy would remember this night, not for the power of the aliens or the fury of their assault, but for the courage of a single human who had stood firm when all others had fled. And as the ship shook from another distant explosion, Elias prepared for the next wave, ready to defend, to adapt, and to survive. For humans, he knew, did not bend to fear. They stood, they fought, and they endured. The starship groaned under the strain of constant bombardment. Sparks flew from damaged panels, and smoke filled the corridors, painting everything in shades of red and orange. Elias stood in the central control hub, his chest heaving from exhaustion, eyes scanning the approaching enemy forces. He knew they would come again, stronger, smarter, and more relentless. But he was ready. From orbit, the Empress watched the human holding her empire's lifeline with a mixture of awe and worry. She had escaped safely, but she could not help but wonder how one human could withstand what would have overwhelmed any alien warrior. Elias had proven what she had suspected about humanity. Resourcefulness, courage, and intelligence could match raw power. The enemy commander had survived the previous battle, battered but alive, and was advancing with reinforcements. Elias knew this confrontation would determine whether the Empress's empire would survive the night. He tightened his grip on the control console and adjusted the energy barriers, rerouting auxiliary power to create overlapping defensive zones. Every corridor had been rigged with traps and environmental hazards, but the final battle would require more than traps. It would require his mind. As the first wave of enemy soldiers entered the hub, Elias moved with precision. He ducked behind a control panel as laser fire scorched the walls. With quick, calculated movements, he activated a gravity disruptor, sending 3 attackers tumbling into a pile. Sparks erupted where energy weapons struck the floor, and a nearby conduit overloaded, throwing flames across the room. The aliens hesitated, startled by the humans' unpredictable tactics. Elias advanced, using his environment to gain an advantage. He dodged incoming blasts, rerouted power to the defense turrets, and even manipulated the ship's ventilation system to create smoke screens. The aliens were strong and fast, but their strength made them predictable. Every move Elias made exploited their rigidity, turning their superior numbers against them. The enemy commander appeared, massive and imposing, his armor dented and smoking. Elias faced him without fear. He had studied the commander's movements during the previous battle and knew how to anticipate his attacks. The commander lunged, swinging a massive energy blade, but Elias ducked and triggered a floor panel to shoot upward, knocking the commander off balance. Sparks flew as the blade clanged against the reinforced metal. Elias countered swiftly, using a combination of agility and quick thinking to create distance. He grabbed a nearby energy cell and hurled it toward the commander, causing a controlled explosion that forced the enemy to retreat temporarily. The human's mind worked faster than the enemy's strength could adapt, and he continued to set traps and manipulate the environment to his advantage. Through the comm link, the Empress's voice was calm but firm. "Elias, the fleet is ready to assist. You need only hold a little longer." "I'm not done yet," Elias replied, determination shining in his eyes. "I need to make sure they can't follow her." He knew that defeating the commander would demoralize the enemy forces, but he needed a plan that did not rely solely on brute force. Humans excelled in strategy, and Elias intended to prove it. He lured the commander into a narrow corridor, rigged with overlapping energy fields. Every step the enemy took triggered defensive measures that forced him back repeatedly. Frustration grew in the commander's movements, giving Elias the upper hand. With a final calculated maneuver, Elias triggered the corridor's main energy conduit, creating a controlled overload. The commander was caught in the resulting shockwave, momentarily incapacitated but still alive. Elias used the opportunity to seal the corridor and reroute the enemy's remaining forces into another trap. Chaos erupted as the aliens struggled to navigate the hazards, their numerical advantage neutralized. Elias pressed forward to secure the hub, reinforcing barriers and rerouting power to defensive systems. He moved with the precision of a master tactician, predicting enemy movements and countering every threat. The ship itself seemed to respond to him, its failing systems bending to his ingenuity. Every enemy advance was met with a carefully calculated response that turned their strength into weakness. Outside, the Empress watched as the human took control of the situation with unmatched skill. She knew that humans were capable of great courage, but seeing it in action was awe-inspiring. Elias was not just fighting for survival. He was shaping the battlefield, protecting her empire with intelligence, bravery, and an unwavering sense of duty. Inside the hub, Elias' stamina was tested. He had been fighting for hours, but he refused to falter. Humans endured where others might crumble. He dodged another wave of attackers, activating a sequence that caused a temporary collapse of the corridor behind them. The enemy was trapped, giving him control of the battlefield once more. Finally, the commander recovered and charged again, but Elias was ready. Using a combination of environmental hazards and precise strikes, he incapacitated the commander without killing him, ensuring that the enemy forces would retreat. The remaining soldiers, demoralized and disoriented, withdrew from the hub, unable to continue without leadership. Elias allowed himself a moment to breathe, surveying the chaos he had created. The corridors were littered with disabled enemies, collapsed sections, and the faint hum of the ship's failing systems. He had held the line, protected the Empress, and ensured that her path to safety was clear. The Empress's pods had landed safely on a nearby planet. She had survived the night, thanks to the human who had stood firm when all others had fled. Elias activated the ship's emergency beacons, signaling the Empress's fleet for extraction. Reinforcements arrived swiftly, securing the ship and ensuring that no enemy could follow. As the dust settled and the smoke cleared, the Empress's warriors approached Elias, their expressions a mix of admiration and respect. They had witnessed firsthand the human's courage, ingenuity, and determination. Elias, exhausted but unbroken, stood among them, a symbol of what humanity could achieve in the galaxy. The Empress approached him personally, her expression serene but filled with gratitude. "You have done more than any warrior could," she said softly. "You have proven the strength of your kind." Elias nodded, a small smile forming despite the exhaustion. "Humans survive, we adapt, we fight when others would flee." Her gaze was steady, understanding the weight of his words. "Your courage has saved not only me, but the future of our empire. Earth will be remembered as more than a distant world." Elias allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Humans had once again shown that they were not defined by their size or strength, but by their mind, their courage, and their ability to endure against all odds. The HFY moment was complete, not in destruction, but in the triumph of intelligence, strategy, and bravery. As the Empress's fleet departed to secure new territory and regroup, Elias remained briefly aboard the starship, ensuring that all systems were stabilized. He moved through the corridors, checking each barricade, each trap, and every damaged system. Even in the aftermath, his mind was sharp, anticipating future threats and ensuring that no enemy could exploit weaknesses. Finally, he stood at the central control hub, looking out through the viewport at the stars stretching infinitely before him. The galaxy was vast and full of dangers, but humans had shown once more that they could stand firm, protect what mattered, and prevail where others might fail. Elias took a deep breath, the weight of the night's battles pressing on him, yet he felt a quiet pride. The Empress's fleet would continue its journey, strengthened by their escape, but they would always remember the human who had held the line, whose courage and ingenuity had turned the tide. Elias had become a symbol, not just for humans, but for the possibilities that humanity represented in the galaxy. As reinforcements arrived to secure the starship fully, Elias finally allowed himself to rest. The night had been long, the battles fierce, but humanity had prevailed. He had protected the Empress, safeguarded her empire, and demonstrated the indomitable spirit of his species. And in that moment, as the ship's alarms faded and the hum of the engines settled into a steady rhythm, Elias understood something profound. Humans did not just survive. Humans adapted. Humans stood firm. And humans, when faced with impossible odds, could achieve greatness that would echo across the stars for generations to come. The galaxy had witnessed a new kind of heroism that night, not defined by alien strength or overwhelming firepower, but by courage, intelligence, and unyielding determination. And Elias, the human who had stood firm when all others fled, would be remembered as a testament to the power of humanity. The stars outside the viewport twinkled with endless possibilities. Somewhere out there, other threats awaited, other challenges loomed. But Elias was ready. Humans were ready, and the galaxy would never underestimate them again.